I worked as a PSW for about 6 years before I became a nurse. And during that time, I worked in a lot of nursing homes and did home care across Northern Ontario. But there was one place that always stood out to me: a small Christian nursing home in a rural area that was connected directly to a chapel where they held weekly church services. And being a religious person myself, I actually enjoyed working there because it felt quieter than most places, almost peaceful, especially at night when everything settled down. But this was during COVID, so even though it looked calm on the surface, the workload was brutal. I was picking up as many shifts as I could, sometimes working 16 hours straight, barely sleeping, just trying to make money. And one particular day, I worked my regular shift starting at 7 in the morning on my usual floor. And then I picked up another shift starting at 11 p.m. on a completely different unit. It wasn't a floor I normally worked on, and I didn't know the residents there very well. But at that point, I didn't really care because I was exhausted and just going through the motions. And when I got report from the nurse, she mentioned there was a new resident in room 412, said she was legally blind but fully alert and oriented. Nothing about it sounded unusual, so I didn't think twice about it. And during my first round around 1 a.m., I went into her room to introduce myself. I'll call her Mary. She was sitting upright in bed with her hands folded, facing toward the door, like she had been waiting. And as soon as I walked in, she greeted me politely, almost overly polite. The kind of resident who says sorry for everything. And I told her to use the call bell if she needed anything. And she said she didn't want to be any trouble for us, which in our line of work is what we call an easy resident. And at the time, I was relieved, so I finished my rounds. And for the next hour or so, everything was quiet. Too quiet, actually. I was sitting at the nursing station, watching YouTube on my phone, answering the occasional call bell. But most of the unit was asleep. And around 2 a.m. I went for my break, came back around 2:30, and nothing had changed. The hallway lights were dim, barely lighting the floor, and the whole place had that late night stillness, where every sound feels louder than it should. And then, out of nowhere, I heard someone yelling, "Help! Help!" And it wasn't a loud scream, more like a desperate call, just loud enough to carry down the hallway. It was a female voice. But since I didn't know the residents on that floor too well, I couldn't immediately tell who it was. And some residents call out like that instead of using the call bell. So I got up quickly and followed the sound. And as I walked down the hallway, the voice got clearer, and I realized it was coming from room 412, Mary's room. And I pushed the door open and said, "Mary, it's me, Sam. Are you okay?" And she sounded terrified, not confused, not disoriented, actually terrified. And she reached her hands out toward me and said, "Please help me. Save me from this man in my room." And I froze, because the room was empty. There was no one there. But I stepped further inside anyway, and took her hand, trying to calm her down, telling her everything was okay, that I was there, that nobody else was in the room. But as soon as I touched her hand, something changed. She turned her head toward me and locked her gaze directly onto my face. And her eyes were wide open, completely still. And for a split second, I genuinely thought she could see me, which didn't make any sense because I knew she was legally blind. But the way she was staring didn't feel like someone who couldn't see. It felt like she was looking straight through me. And I don't know why, but that moment scared me more than anything she was saying. and I tried to keep my voice steady and asked if maybe she had a bad dream, but she immediately shook her head and said, "No, he's been here. He's just standing there, watching me." And I turned around and looked at every corner of the room again, and there was nothing. So I told her again that nobody was there. But she started breathing faster and gripping my hand tighter. And then slowly, she lifted her other hand and pointed to a spot right beside me. And I mean right beside me, close enough that if someone was actually standing there, I would have felt it. And her voice dropped like she was whispering, and she said, "He's standing next to you. He's looking at you now. Tell him to leave." And at that exact moment, I felt this cold sensation along the side of my neck, like someone had just stepped into my space. And I didn't turn right away. I just stood there completely still, trying to convince myself it was nothing. And then I stepped back slowly and told her, again, that nobody was there, even though at that point I wasn't entirely sure anymore. And I paged my charge nurse, and when she came in, we both reassured Mary, and eventually she gave her medication to calm her down. And after a while, Mary settled and stopped pointing, and we left the room. And when we got back to the nursing station, I tried to laugh it off and said she must have been dreaming, but the nurse didn't laugh. She just looked at me for a few seconds like she was deciding whether or not to say something. And then she told me that before Mary moved into that room, there was a man living there. And I didn't react at first because residents pass away all the time. But then she said he died in that room, sitting in the chair by the window. And then she lowered her voice and said he was a known sex offender who used to wander into female residents' rooms at night, just to stand there and watch them. And in some cases, he would grab their hands, and they had multiple complaints about him before he passed. And I didn't say anything because, without even thinking about it, I remembered exactly where Mary had been pointing, right beside me, near the window, exactly where that chair was. And for the rest of that shift, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I walked past room 412, I avoided looking inside, because something about that doorway just felt off. And when I finally did my last round before morning, just before shift change, I forced myself to go in. And Mary was asleep, and the room was quiet. But the chair by the window wasn't in the same position anymore. It had been turned slightly, facing the bed. And I don't remember touching it. And I don't remember anyone else going in that room after we left.